Thank you everyone for joining us tonight for our African Book Club. My name is Nia McAllister and I'm the Public Programs Manager at MOAD. And as we gather here, it is essential to acknowledge the times we're living in and the circumstances that we're navigating. MOAD affirms Black Lives Matter and recognizes the ongoing systemic violence against Black people. We honor and mourn the senseless murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, Casey Goodson Jr., Patrick Warren Sr., Andre Hill, Dante Wright, Anthony Thompson Jr., Ma'Khia Bryant, and so many others who lost their lives in police brutality and racial injustice, including those whose names we do not know. We want to acknowledge that MOAD's commitment to racial justice is ongoing, and as such, we will continue to say these names, to hold space, and to honor these victims. I also want to acknowledge the physical spaces that we're occupying. Though we're all gathered here virtually, many of us are settlers, immigrants, or descendants of those forcibly brought to this continent. And our institutions were founded on the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands we're located. It's with deep respect that MOAD acknowledges that even in virtual space, we here in what we call San Francisco and Oakland reside on unceded Chochenyo and Ramaytush Ohlone lands. And we thank these indigenous communities of the Bay Area and beyond who've stewarded the land throughout the generations. Now, this African Book Club is a monthly program that we host here at MOAD, and we're very fortunate to have partnered with Faith Adiele since fall of 2019. She is the original founder of African Book Club, and so wonderfully invited us to be a partner in this program. And it's really been a whole journey the last almost 2 years, I guess, that we've been doing this monthly series. And so it's wonderful that many folks are now able to join us that were in this virtual space. So unfortunately, Faith will not be able to join us for today's discussion, but Elizabeth and I will guide us through today's program, and of course, everyone's lively thoughts and insights from reading this book. So this month, we're going to be discussing the book, The Dragonfly Sea, a novel by Yvonne Adhiambo Owuor. And it is set across many different locations. Begins in the island of Pate, which is off the coast of Kenya, travels to China through the sea, travels to Turkey. And again, I think the sea is really the binding force that we'll see throughout this book, no pun intended. And it was quite a novel to read, I will admit, speed read, if you will. But I'm very excited to hear everyone's thoughts today. We have a pretty intimate group, so I think we'll be able to kind of facilitate everyone sharing. But just to make sure that we still center respect in this space, if you have something to share, either please physically raise your hand or use, I think there's a reaction where you can raise your hand just to signal if you have something to share. And again, wait a couple of folks in between sharing again. So I think to start us off, I would love for people to share their first impressions of the book. And maybe when you do speak for the first time, do introduce yourself, name, any pronouns, or any other information you would like to share. Does anyone want to get us started with first impressions from reading this book?
Well, I'll start.
Go for it.
From Brooklyn, New York. Unfortunately, I didn't finish the book. I should have started reading it soon. But I'm very impressed by the author's writing style. I think she really has a gift for writing. The book moves fairly quickly also. So I'm very happy with this book. I just should have started it earlier, so I couldn't finish it.
Told you so.
Excuse me.
I said, told you so.
Yeah, you did. She told me I was late. So.
I'll add, Oli and I have been friends for over 20 years, so we can talk to each other with that kind of innuendo. I read the book when it first came out because I had loved Dust so much, her first novel. And I just totally loved it in 2019, gave away many copies, and I was so thrilled that we're reading it. And I loved it just as much the second time, if not more. I loved the plot. I love the setting. I love the language so much. I loved all the Kiswahili sayings at the beginning of so many of the chapters. To read such a long, wonderful, rich, I guess it's called a coming of age story, was just, oh, so wonderful. Such adventures through so many different tragedies and just adventures. I loved it, loved it, loved it.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm curious, maybe throughout the discussion today, if there's anything you picked up on the second read that you didn't pick up the first read. I'd be curious about hearing about that.
Thanks.
Anyone else have some first impressions from reading the book? Go for it, Yeva.
I'm Yeva. I'm in San Francisco, Ramaytush, Olanilands. This is, I am enjoying the book, let's just say. It is, like Ole said, it's a long book. Somehow it is not a quick read at all for me. And so I'm sad that I was trying to finish it, but I wasn't able to. But also I'm finding it's a very dense and rich book. There's just a lot there. And so I am a little bit disappointed. I didn't realize until we read this book that for the Swahili phrases that I don't know, Swahili does not work as well. I'm just looking stuff up on the internet, like other languages we've encountered, Italian, various other languages I don't know. And I was able to look stuff up. Luckily, this word shikamo, I spent a couple months in Tanzania. So that's the one word I know. So I know what that's like. So that's cool, it's really fun. But I also, because I'm in the middle of the book, the main character has just arrived in Turkey. It's like there's a sense of foreboding of like some horrible things have already happened. So I'm in a state of a little bit of worry, but don't feel no pressure. Tell me what it's about. I don't care. I'm going to read the book, but it's beautifully written, but it also reads as like somebody, I don't have as much knowledge of all the different places. My knowledge seems very small, that it could be, a person with greater knowledge might have even greater appreciation for the story and the narration, but it's very interesting. And there are a lot of words in English I'm looking up too. So there's various perfume related words. I had no idea. So yeah. Oh, thanks. Somebody put in the chat asking Siri. I'm not on good terms with Siri, but I could try.
Great, thank you for sharing, Yeva. Totally agree that it was a very thorough read. Definitely with speed reading till the end, but agree with you on the kind of beautiful complexity of the language, the different forms of language, how it shows up throughout the book. Any other first impressions or initial thoughts? People are welcome to also kind of start pulling out themes or things that they notice that they want to dive into. Peggy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'd like to share my first impressions. So when I started reading the book, it just felt kind of whimsical to me. It was, Ayaana, how lovely the little girl was, and how she was, playing in the ocean, and I just couldn't quite get grounded in the book. And when it really drew me in was when Munira and Ayaana and Muhidin had more of a relationship, and they had formed their little family. I got into it a lot more, and I was reading, spending more time reading and not wanting to quit once that started. And right now I'm about halfway through the book, and they're still on Pate Island, except for Muhidin has gone off. And I think Muhidin, and I think maybe he's in Turkey. Maybe next we're going, or I don't know. So yeah, I'm reading it, and I'm happy to hear people talk about the whole book. I'm sure I'll read through to the end, and I'm not worried about someone telling me what happens. But right now I'm just so shocked about Munira even considering selling her daughter to those men. That's kind of the last thing that happened. And I can't believe she would do that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Peggy. Yeah, that was definitely a turning point, and I would agree that it took me a while to get into the narration. I would say almost like a third or halfway through, I find that it picked up a pace for me, and so maybe some of you will find that later in the book, that it gets to a point where you almost can't stop reading, which is exciting. Any other impressions?
I just want to piggyback and say that I had similar experience. I had a hard time getting into it at first, and I found myself like rereading pages over and over again because I realized I wasn't really comprehending what I was reading. And then, you know, as it got into more of a traditional narrative structure, and the stories started to intertwine, then I got more into it, and also had the thing of like, no, okay, now I can't put it down. But I think that might be an interesting thing to talk about, is like the lyricism of her writing, and how that can contribute or distract from a narrative. And then I also, yeah, well, I have a lot of other things to say, but that was my first impression.
Yeah, I think the narration would be something interesting to focus on. I had read, I forget now what platform I read it on, but there was some review of the book discussing kind of holistically the book, but it did make note of kind of the unknown narrator of the book, because it is narrated in third person, but I felt like there were a couple instances, which I now haven't marked in my book or can't find, where it seemed to switch, maybe even just for a paragraph or one very short chapter, to second person, which I wish I had taken better note of. And so I just found that interesting that was noted in this kind of synopsis and review of the book, just the kind of characteristics or the way that it was narrated, this kind of unknowing but all-knowing narrator kind of floats along throughout all these different locations with Ayaana throughout the book. So yeah, if anyone has thoughts about the narration, what it did for you as you were reading, if it was, again, easy to get into, hard, if it was distracting, any thoughts on that?
I think, I'm
Sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as someone who's just getting into the book, some of the feedback that I'm hearing from other folks is kind of validating of my experience as well. I tend to be a slow reader, and I think that it's because I'm kind of having almost a conversation with myself as I'm reading it. I think on some level, like you know, there are times where I'll push through a novel to get through the story, but oftentimes I'm like, I feel like I'm reading critically to kind of evaluate what kind of experience I'm having. And I tend to really love prose poetry and dense poetry, particularly if there's this beautiful extended metaphor that kind of operates through just the layering, I guess, of language. And I was surprised that I was actually finding it difficult. And I thought, you know, maybe I'm over caffeinated right now. Maybe that's why my brain is zipping around. But I actually think that when I started to question myself, like, well, what is the experience that I'm having with this metaphor? There were moments where the layering of metaphor seemed almost tangled, rather than being like this fractal series of extended metaphors. There would be in a single sentence three metaphorical references that weren't clearly related to me, and I'm not far enough into it, and there may be passages that I need to go back and reread and ask myself, like, is that my actual critique of the writing? But I'm glad to hear that the experience other folks have had with the book, that it started to change a little bit. And so maybe I can find an access point. but I'm experiencing, I guess, the lyricism, the prose poetry of this person's writing. And then also I'm asking myself whether or not this person's approach to prose poetry works for me. So we'll see. I mean, I don't question that the story will be affecting and valuable, but I also am experiencing this sensation of being in a jungle, and I have a machete, and I'm chopping through the jungle to get to the location that I know is going to be incredible when I arrive. So the language is really dense, and at this point, it is feeling a little bit like a barrier. But thanks for giving me a little bit of a preview, I guess, of the experiences that other folks are having.
That was a great metaphor to describe the process of reading. I definitely think what I was talking about in terms of, for me, later on it picked up, and it's not that necessarily kind of the metaphors died down, but just that the plot kind of intensified to a degree where I could still appreciate the language. But I was on kind of the edge of my seat figuring, okay, what's the next thing that's going to happen? Something just that I'm thinking about hearing all of this is reading this and hearing kind of the lyrical language that was used throughout the book really makes me, it felt very dreamlike reading this, and it brought me back to both kind of the length and intensity of The Old Drift, which some of you in this group may have read as well. That was one of our books in early 2020, I believe. Another very long book by Namwali Serpell, but again, the language kind of mirrored that in my mind, and just kind of weaving in and out of a kind of dreamlike state, but then also plots that would just kind of pick up surprisingly. Does anyone else have thoughts about the use of language? Yeah, Eva.
I think that's really interesting that you mentioned The Old Drift. Although all I can say is this book is, I mean, I read a lot, and we're gonna have another book. And I was so excited about the other author. I read their first book, which is why I didn't get started on this one early enough. But I think it's not just the language, but it's also the form, the structure of this novel, where there's all these small numbers, which I don't understand the numbering system, and it doesn't have chapters and the space, and they're just different ways text is broken up on the page that doesn't, it's not a place, I'm not getting rest points where I might need them, like a rest with the words so you can soak up the meaning or put that away and figure out where to start again. But I find it interesting when you mentioned The Old Drift, which that was another book that I didn't finish it in time. So it's nice that when they go over 400 pages with a lot of words I have to look up, that's going to be, I didn't realize it. So, but The Old Drift had all kinds of funny stories in them that I didn't find it difficult to read it, and that, you know, who knows what, it may be to keep track of all the different tales and stories, but they were a lot of easy to read stories of, like, you know, sort of, I don't know, 100 Years of Solitude or something. They're different. It just brought up, it was just a different way, a different tone, a different manner. This one is like more like very, you can't speed through it. I can't speed through it. Anyway, I cannot speed through it. I'll just speak for myself. I cannot speed through it because I might be missing. It operates on multiple levels at once. It can't be rushed. And so no matter how compelling, it's like, what's happening, what language, who's she with, or who's there. So, and it's a partially omniscient. It's an interesting thing that you mentioned also about the narrator. They're playing with that. It's almost an unreliable, semi-omniscient narrator. That's what I would call it. You know, like there's foreshadowing, like, oh, you know, Ayaana wished she didn't know at the time when she said blah, 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 that it was going to be horrible. And you just like, I don't know when later that happens repeatedly. So, but it doesn't feel like a totally reliable narrator, but I don't know if I'm capturing all those details to go back and check. And it's not set up in an easy way to check, to be like, oh, that was chapter, 47 or 57 or 12 or 15 or whatever. Or they're not chapters, they're little slivets of, 2 or 3 pages. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
A comment.
Pamela.
I think that the author's language is it's very sort of thick. But I think for me, it's almost an attempt to get us to see the world the way Ayaana sees it. In other words, I think that Ayaana, she's so, her senses are so alive. Her perceptions are mostly through the senses. I mean, what she's learned about the stars, what she's learned about fragrances. And it's as if the language is trying to get me, the reader, to like slow down and experience or come close to experiencing life on all those multi-sensate levels and trying to make sense of it. I don't know if that makes sense.
Sorry. No, that definitely, there's just so many different kind of elements to take in as you're reading. And I think that's what a lot of us are experiencing. It's like we want to focus on the plot, but we also are like deep into the language, and how do you balance both as you're reading? I see Peggy has a hand up as well.
Oh, I started thinking about how we get so much backstory about the characters. It's so interesting. I mean, like we know Munira for a long time, and then gradually we get little pieces of her backstory. And then there's other people like Ziryab, Muhidin's son. We got so much backstory about him. And yet in the present, when he's there with them, he's pretty flat, at least for me. He kind of doesn't do anything. He's just there. And then there's another guy that we got a lot of backstory in, the fisherman from China, who we find out from his backstory that he was like an expert torturer. And so I get like all that backstory about him, and then I'm like, okay, so that must mean that I need to know about him because he's going to do something in the present narrative of the book. But at least so far he hasn't. So far in the part I'm reading, he hasn't done anything. He's just kind of there in the village on the island. And I don't know. I think there are a couple other people too, where I get the feeling that I get this backstory on them, and then, okay, I'm anticipating that something's going to happen with them, but it hasn't happened yet. Just that.
I feel like one of the reasons she gives that like very rich backstory about different characters is because I think this book is telling us a story about sort of the diasporic nature and sort of cultural melange of East Africa, and all the different people and religions and cultures that make up the place that the story is about. And so that's the texture that she's providing to show that kind of cultural mix, I think. And that
really makes sense, Elizabeth.
I think going back to what Yeva was saying about just being able to kind of chart everything that was happening and the breaks in the chapters. I remember like in the old drift, there was that whole family tree in the beginning that really helped ground me, because I kept going back saying, okay, how are people connected? And it does feel that way in some cases, that like you really get a deep dive into a person that we jump to a whole different place and we're focusing in. And sometimes the information carries over into later parts that we kind of key this into what's happening. But I almost wish I had like a map as I was reading this. Like obviously I know where the different geographic regions are, but like to follow, okay, where are the characters now? Who is simultaneously in these two different places, and when are they going to intersect? I just felt like it was very visual, and I wanted to have that to accompany it, because there were so many different things and we jumped between time or between place. And I kind of had to remember, okay, what was happening when we last left this location? and what's been happening while we were gone. But that's also kind of the beauty of it, that it weaves between, as Elizabeth was saying, all these different locations that are all connected through these kind of key figures, but we get to flip between time and place. For me, another interesting character was Lai Jin, who is so the captain on the ship, who is also a potter, and just like, again, learning so many layers of this character. Also his relationship with Ayaana was very interesting. I'm wondering if anyone has any thoughts about that kind of narrative path.
Well, the complexity of his role, and I mean, the whole sea voyage was just an amazing epic in and of itself. And then with the scrap metal that began to bleed, and his choice, the choice that he made between what his obligation was to his crew, to his ship, to his company, and the choice that he made that I thought was just, I mean, morally, it was the only choice to make, but he knew right away what a price he was going to have to pay, and what a price he did pay. And then the storm, and when Ayaana was going down to try to find the watch, and getting injured, and that was just to me one of the most amazing parts of the book. I just loved it so much. It was so sexy. God, it was just really erotic. I don't know if y'all have gotten to that part yet. I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's really erotic. It's one of the best love scenes I have ever read in my life. Got me really hot.
Major spoiler for everyone who has not gotten to that point.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, there are other good love scenes too, but that one is the best.
Did you question her attraction to him though?
Not at all. I mean, because it was drawn so slowly, and it was about her attraction to mysteries, but also her ability to see so much. I mean, her first question to him is something like, how did the fire draw on your face? What an interesting way of phrasing it. I mean, you know, she's who she is. She has to ask that question. And I don't think he had ever been asked anything like that before. And the way he was holding back and holding back and holding back. Just loved it. So, no, I mean, I would just do anything he asked me to do at least twice. I thought he was very attractive. And rich. Whoa. I mean, but, you know, with so much backstory of his own. I mean, the death of his wife. Geez, Louise, I mean, how much can these people bear? Oof.
There was always something very melancholy about his character for me. I think I have a favorite page in the book, which is 302. And it's like, it's one of those, 302. And it's one of those chapters that's literally like one paragraph long, and it's so poetic, but it's describing him working with clay. And it does cue you in that, like, after the ship, then he was imprisoned, that he's since been out, but that he's like turning to this craft. But just the way that it's described, I think, was just my favorite. But you kind of see this, for me, it felt very sad, and that feeling is carried throughout. And it also makes me think about how kind of objects are tied to place and also tied to feeling. as we see him then later gift, I think it's after this, or maybe it's before, when he gifts, he's the one sending those ceramics to Ayaana, and then thinking about the swap that like he has Muhidin's watch and how these objects are so important, but also tied to ideas of home or tied to these relationships. That was just a passage I kept thinking about even after moving through the rest of the story.
Do you want to read that passage? It's so beautiful.
Sure. Yeah, I can read it.
Great.
Yeah, so if anyone has the book in front of them, it's page 303, chapter 66. Weaving clay, tugging at the tides and drawing time inward, feeling, touching, watering, molding new life, the vessels. There was age in the dust, there were memories and ashes from the press of earth on souls. When he touched the clay, it was as prayer, and he knew the prayer was for life. It was either this or die. Weaving clay, sewing up the holes in his life, cowlin stains on a man's overalls, his fingers wrapped around the roundish, moist gray lump of clay pressed to a rotating wheel head. His dampened hand slapped the clay, creating evenness. Squeeze, pull, cradle, shape. He moved his thumb, feeling his way into a center, pressing the lump down and inward. His right hand pressed the clay down. He dampened his hand. He was getting better at communing with the clay, knowing when to stretch it, smooth it, add water, and soothe it. He worked it up as the wheel turned and the hole widened. Right hand, fingers, both hands cradled the lump, giving it a form. His hands thinned the sides of the clay. The vessel had started to emerge inside the neglected shelter he had reclaimed. Now he smoothed the mouth. He was starting with the basics, remembering the terse dreams of a silent mother. Like her then, he too had lost himself. Now a repossession of meaning, memory by memory, while trimming the vessel he had created with a scalpel, removing the extraneous things. He would be using a firing mound. This was his 35th attempt. If he were to be grateful for just one thing from this unfair prison sojourn, it was that he had hand-roughened, soul-crushing labor on the fields and roads had offered him a reacquaintance with soils.
Yeah, just great.
Nia, what's the name of the character who's described in the passage you just read?
This is Lyjin.
So he's the captain of the vessel, Lao Jin? Yeah. Yeah, I hadn't marked that passage, so thank you very much. I have to say, I was a little mystified by the Turkey episodes. I was just, I mean, I guess they were necessary for some lessons that Ayaana had to learn about herself, about her ability to see through and beyond the surface of things. But the Turkish guy was just such a jerk, and his family was so awful that I just wanted to get through it. I mean, he just kept messing with her. I didn't understand him. I guess in classical literary analysis terms, he's the antagonist. But I could have done without that whole hunk, frankly.
I think it was hard to read that section of the book, though I would say that is where the kind of, for me, the pace quickened, because again, I was trying to figure out how is she going to get out of this. Though I felt like, as we had spoken about earlier, that there were some kind of keys in the language that kind of gave away that something was off in this dynamic between the two of them, or maybe she had spoken in retrospect in some cases, being like, oh, I should have recognize, the smirk or the kind of air that he carried. But I think she learns a lot from that situation and kind of finds a return to herself and a return to what she really wants, which is, finding home and family. So definitely a roundabout way of getting there, but I think for her character development, it was a very interesting section of the book to focus on. Does anyone else have thoughts, if you have made it to this point, thoughts about that section or any other part of the book as well? We're doing a lot of spoilers.
It's funny, like I actually liked that part of the book, not because it was super painful to read, but also like I loved that she did have the strength and the like cleverness to get out of it. And it just showed a real strength, and she always had been sort of pushing the boundaries of what girls and women could do and what their place is. And so I thought that was just, another really powerful example of that. And also I think she gets involved with him because everyone in the book is like searching for how they belong in the place that they are. And I think he, gives her this comfort, and that, like, he thinks she's beautiful and he charms her, and she falls for it a little bit, and she gets tricked by him and she figures it out. But I think, they're both outsiders. Neither of them are Chinese, and they're in China at the school together, and they end up with this connection. And then once she gets into it, it turns bad quickly. But it's also showing like the difference of who people are inside and outside of their comfort zone, because obviously like he was a totally different person at home in his house than he was at the school. And I think there's a lot of that, of like, who are you when you're outside of your home or outside of where your comfort zone is, and how do you find your identity in these different locations?
That's interesting.
That's a great way of putting it. I didn't even like think to say it so succinctly, but that makes so much sense. That we see kind of the evolution of all these characters who are kind of pushed to these extremes in some ways. Even her mother, kind of making that debate whether to sell her child to these strangers, and like you see her, all the things she has to gain and also to lose and to sacrifice, and also the full circles that they make in terms of choosing themselves. Various characters, what that means, choosing themselves throughout the book.
Yeah, thank you for that. I wrote it down, Elizabeth. I like that. Searching for how they belong in the place that they're in. Yeah.
Were there any other passages that stood out to people throughout the book, wherever you may be in the book? Any sections that really struck you? Yeah, Pamela?
Thanks. I know I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. So on page 319, there's this little short thing. And I think it's in the turkey place. But it was almost encapsulates the whole book. So it's on page 319, and she's interacting with Kore, and she's thinking to herself, and these are words from Muhidin. The most important things are concealed in the unseen. The most essential truths inhabit the unspoken. And I just love that. Those same lines come up somewhere else. I really felt like this is the complexity of her character. She's seeing these things that are concealed in the unseen. It's a whole other way to look at life beyond new cars and whatever else distracts us. I just love that.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that quote. I just marked that page. That is a really wonderful quote. I like how these kind of quotes from Muhidin, but keep coming back throughout the book, because she keeps returning to, wisdom that was given to her by other people. And I also liked, I think someone had mentioned earlier, the use of the quotes at the beginning of each of these sections. I loved how those kind of grounded us, and always, went back to that motif of the sea as well.
I think I was going to say, I think it's interesting that I think one of we were talking about backstories, but I think one of the reasons to have these these backstories I see as a way of doing world building, like true world building in a way that's complex and interesting. And what I'm seeing now is, I think it's good to kind of know the characters know some of the backstory and some they don't know. There's things nobody can know, or this particular location is a place where people come from all over, but the main characters, like, well, at least the Ayaana and the ship captain and this Kore, I don't know the Kore, but the ship captain, they are mixed characters. They're mixed people in their own setting, like Ayaana being this Chinese descendant, perhaps with this unknown father. She's different. Even the ship captain to be Uyghur and Japanese mother, and the mother was mixed too. It was Uyghur and Japanese. I think that sounds to me like quite an unusual combination, but what do I know? But what I know of Japan and the Uyghurs, I've never heard of any connection like that. And then with somebody Chinese, that had affected this Lai Zhen's whole life. Like they're all kind of outsiders in a very complicated way, and they're travelers. So I think that's part of the reason for all these different backstories. I was going to ask about the mother, Munira. To me, in that section, I interpreted she did not decide to sell her daughter off, right? I thought she really didn't have a choice. I thought, I didn't seem like there wasn't a choice. They gave her the choice and she could have sold her off, but they're going to do it whatever she said, they're going to still do whatever the thing was on that particular Thursday. It was going to happen regardless of what she said. So that's how I interpreted. Tell me if I'm wrong, maybe I'm wrong, but I thought that's why she just tried to prepare her best as possible, because she had no way of escaping, because that Muhidin guy was in prison at the time that happened anyway, couldn't protect him this time the way that he had previously with the prior person. But and it's just interesting with the global, it has stuff going on in the world, because wherever that person came from are things that we can relate to and that affect us in this country and our own news, and different, there's these shadowy terrorist groups or whatever they're doing. So it was just interesting that way. And it might be seen from Ayaana's perspective that her mother was doing that, but really it did not seem like, it's like, give us your daughter or give us your daughter. That's how I read it.
Yeah, I think it's all about the power dynamics. I think she's in that kind of 5 minutes of deliberation and seeing all the things that she could gain. I think she turns and then she ends up saying, come on Thursday. So even though it is kind of that affirmative, like giving in, it's definitely not entirely willingly in my mind. I think there's still so much of her that's like, doesn't want to compromise her daughter, obviously. And there was an interesting thing I remember reading in that section where the guy seems to be relieved when she walks away, but then she calls out being like, come on Thursday. And that kind of puzzled me in his relief that she was saying no. So it's definitely a complicated dynamic, but from my impression, she ends up kind of going through with this agreement, but then obviously cuts it off in the midst because she's realizing the implications of what she's agreed to. I see Peggy, you have your hand raised as well.
Oh, I was just really intrigued with both of your comments about Munira giving or selling her daughter. And I remember what you just talked about, Mia, where the man, when she said no, the man who was trying to make the deal with her was relieved. I remember that part and I was thinking, oh, good, he didn't really want it to happen. He wanted her to say no, and now it's not going to happen. But then, of course, it did go on to happen. And I just felt, so heartsick when that was happening. And it didn't enter into my mind what you said, Yeva, that she knew she didn't have a choice. I was just assuming that she did somehow have a choice, but I can really see how she might not have. The other thing that came up for me was when the last few moments that people have been talking was this idea of people voyaging and all this mixture of cultures and the things you've been talking about, and people that are of, mixed ethnicities and things like that. But one of the themes that I've noticed in the part that I've read so far is that people are looking for a place where they belong. They're looking for a place that they can call home. And that's Muhidin and his son and Munira. They're all coming back to the island after, different adventures, but they, in their excursions into the world ended up feeling like they needed to go back to a place where they belonged, and that was home for them. And I think that's such a universal theme. I wonder if it continues in the book past where I've read.
It does.
Definitely. And I think also like the setting of it being an island plays into that too, that there's all this natural coming and going on an island. There is, it's cut off, but it's also a place of interdependence with other places. And then also then of course we haven't really talked at all about the sea and the role of the sea, and obviously like the island being in the midst of the sea is important. Did anybody else have trouble remembering that it was set in the current day? Is everybody clear about that the whole time? I kept forgetting. And then something would come up. I'm like, oh yeah, it's right now.
Well, and I think one of the big time markers in the book is, and in a way that's where the Turkey part fits in, is greed and the war on terror and the impact that has on everyone. Even, we don't think about this, but, Munira's arch enemy, seeking her son, Suleiman, who has gone off and has maybe joined al-Shabaab or one of the other groups that we identify as terrorist. And the impact of Chinese commercial interests, especially in East Africa. All over Africa, but especially East Africa, the idea of putting a pipeline over the island. That's kind of there in the background, reminding us that in the midst of all this lyrical, these herbal essences and the henna painting, that there's these quite malevolent forces at work. And then there's a little bit of humanism in terms of in Kore's family when, the patriarch is discovered to be dying of prostate cancer, and the upheaval that will cause. I don't know, it's just, that keeps it very grounded in the present for me, is all of those references.
I think I too was kind of lost between time reading this. For me, actually, what clued me in was the technology. I think kind of similarly in that same period of time when she is with Kore, her, not having access to her phone, or her tossing her phone and having to find ways to communicate and get around that, what she kept referencing her smartphone. And it's like, okay, right. Now I know, I know where we're at. But I think there's something else I was thinking about along those lines. There still is a timelessness. And even what you were saying, Pamela, all of those forces for me, yes, they're contemporary, but they also have such a history to them, that like I assume, you know, that where we are today is also built upon where we've come from, with all those kind of malevolent forces. But it's interesting that it can be a book that feels out of time in some ways. Like I think the way that she like is disconnected from, is it Lyjin? I think disconnected from him, doesn't know what's going on with his life, even though they're in two parts of the same country at the same time, but that she's receiving these kind of anonymous packages, that despite technology and all these other ways to be connected, they'd have no idea that their lives are kind of running parallel and when they'll intersect or not. So I found that interesting, being both grounded in present, but also outside of time.
Yeah, the technology, definitely the smartphone is what kept reminding me, and then some of the current events. But like the whole voyage on the ship felt like it was from a different time period, for me. One of the reviews that I read talked about how every character in the book is very well developed and rich, except for the Islamic extremists, and that is sort of the foil in the book that doesn't get that well developed. I was wondering if anybody had any thoughts about that. Or
Are you talking about Fazul?
just, I mean, there are several different points where it comes into the story, with the with Suleiman, and then with I can't remember his name now, but Muhidin's son, who is kidnapped and tortured, and then with Corey's family and how they're interacting with it. Yeah. But it also had other portrayals of Islam, so she wasn't saying that this is the only Islam, right?
The other characters who don't make out so well are, there aren't very many well-developed Chinese characters, except for the teacher from the embassy, who was so beautifully delineated as a certain kind of career bureaucrat, you know, just taking care of business. I love the way she was drawn, but no other Chinese characters emerged at all. I mean, she had two girlfriends there. Oh, excuse me, sorry. Yeah, I almost don't think of him as Chinese. Yeah, he would be the exception, of course. Yeah. So maybe all the energy for Chinese character went into drawing him, and he was so rich in backstory and character and worldview and ability and just everything. Man of my dreams.
Yeah, I felt like Lyjin and the teacher were kind of represented sort of the duality of China and this ancient culture that has all kinds of artistic and intellectual gifts to the world, and then it also has this like hardline bureaucratic nature, and those two things, it's hard to imagine that those two things live together in China, but they do.
Yeah. And throughout Chinese history. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Was anyone else confused by the relationship between Munira, Muhidin, and his son? Because I feel like I didn't understand that they were all related until like, well, not all related, but like the husband-son dynamic until later in the book, and I was still kind of confused. I think like on page 447, when Ziryab is coming back, he has to correct himself. He's like, oh, I have a daughter. Oh wait, no, I have what did he say?
A sister.
Yeah, and like that was like, oh wait, I didn't quite understand that dynamic. So I was wondering if anyone else was confused or understood it from early on.
So what I thought early on was that Muhidin was falling in love with Munira, or they were both falling in love with each other. But then when, but he was so much older than she was that it was questionable whether the relationship made sense or not. And then when his son comes back, he was really hurt by that, but he stepped back. So that was what I understood. And then I don't know what happens later in the book. So I'm interested to hear
Stay
you talk
tuned.
about it. But you can talk about it. And what were you going to say about page 347?
On 447, this is definitely at the end, so there is a plot twist. Muhidin does not step back, but Ziryab returns again. There's a period where he goes away again. He returns again to find that Muhidin and Munira are together, and there's another child that is now involved, and so Ziryab is trying to correct himself, I guess, and realizing that it's not a daughter, it's a sister. So for me, that clued in all the relationships, but a lot happens in between that initial part and the end of the book.
I was aware of it. I wasn't confused by it, but I was like intrigued by it. All of their connections coming and going was incredible.
But that passage in the middle of the page is so wonderful. So can I read that? It's short. So this is when Ziryab has in fact returned after being tortured and imprisoned, and has tumbled to the fact that his former lover and his father have made a child together. And so after the silence, which lasted 2 days, Ziryab had spoken. He told Munira that it was the memory of her existence that had kept him from being devoured. Then he had a question for her. Why him? She was silent. Then she said, he loves what he knows. He grabbed her forearm. And I don't? She shook her head. You love what you do not know. He had cried. Is that so wrong? No, she whispered, but I am both. I love that.
That's mysterious.
Yes. But, you know, Munira is just an amazingly complex person. And as her backstory unfolds, and we see her devotion to her daughter, I mean, wow. And I guess for me, one of the reasons why that part rings so true is that I am the child of a single mother, and I am the product of a one-night stand. And my mother did not know the identity of my father, or she never, she fed me different stories at different parts of my life. And I've since, you know, I'm still here. But that was just, I think that's one aspect of the book that makes me feel so drawn, because here's Ayaana seeking this father who is in fact so irrelevant to who she is and her life, which is how it was with my biological father.
Except I think it makes it an interesting, I assumed that when the Chinese government came and did the genetic testing, it's not Munira is not the descendant, it's Ayaana. So therefore it is the father. So even though, I mean, you know, in essence or whatever, he doesn't do anything and has not much to do, but that's the key to why she is this chosen person to, it's the impetus for that, why she looks slightly different and this, that, and the other, that somehow she's related to these Chinese people through the father. That's why it's like that.
Because when her backstory is revealed about how the man abandoned her, I did not get the sense that he had any kind of Chinese in him.
Well, that I just think that is it's based on genetic testing and some kind of genetic characteristics. So it's not like he might not have known it or anything, but
Okay.
it was clear to me. It's not like I didn't get the sense, these people. I get the sense that this island, people know they're mixed. There's all kind of people going back and forth. They don't know exactly, but but if you start doing this genetic testing, then that's when lines are drawn. And so in a certain way, the official story is to make her look this way. Obviously, she goes to China and she does not look like, she doesn't really look like the people there. They kind of, the legend begins with the testing. But that testing, to me, a part of the story, just went to this unknown father, because otherwise Munira could go as why couldn't she go as the mother of the descendant? They'd send them both over there to go tour around. And, that's what I would have thought. So, and they were just looking for a nice, likely candidate to do that. And that worked out very well for whatever the delegation, but that's how I interpreted. I, of course, thought this Ziriab was dead the whole time, though. I was not confused, but I thought he was dead. So it's just so interesting that, yeah.
So that part of the story is what is true and is what inspires her to write this book. Is the shipwreck from China happens I don't know, 500 years ago, and in 1995 or 99, I can't remember which, the people come to the island and try to find the descendants, and it's a big news story. But then apparently I don't know if the DNA doesn't check out or what, but they never make a perfect connection, but it's in the news, and it's that news story that inspires the author to write this book in the story.
So does it turn out that Munira and Ziriab had known each other before?
No.
So when he came back, that was the first time she met him? Because it seems like she fell in love with him instantly. So I was wondering if there was some history already. No?
Yeah, we don't get that.
Okay.
But yeah, I agree with you that it did seem like, yeah, she seemed easy to sweep off her feet by those two men, but very strong in sort of keeping her distance from the rest of the island.
But in a different, if you flip it on the other way, she's totally shunned by the rest of the island. Those people are outside. I mean, any man who treated her decently, she's interested, right? And one is older. She wasn't totally interested in Muhidin, the father figure at first, right? And that took a while. She was just getting to know him. She was just opening up to him a little bit. And then this son comes along, and they're attracted to each other in a more, there just is an attraction there. And then as he stepped back that first time, it's like, okay, she had been shunned from a very young age. She was declared off limits to the whole community for any decent treatment, let alone or some kind of romantic relationship, it seemed like. But now there's an author's note in the beginning. There was some real young woman, because I was thinking at the timing, right? But there's more information about it that there is an actual person who was a descendant. It's that, right?
Yeah, it was just, I was looking at reviews, and one of them talked about the specific incident and said that there was never any DNA corroboration.
Oh, huh.
Right.
And I think it was also seen as, it was a way for China to do sort of a PR campaign to connect East Africa and China, because then they were going to come in and do some development.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
I also just really enjoyed, we haven't read much from East Africa, and so it was really nice to read a story from a different location, and then also to have like all of the kind of diasporic interconnectedness be outside of the West, even though like there is some stuff with American troops, but and of course like what's happening with the terrorism is related to the West, but just to have the geographic locations be more Eastern was really interesting. I appreciated that.
And if you ever have a chance to go to Kenya, Lamu is an hour's plane ride from Nairobi. And
Wow.
I have only been to Lamu and Manda. I never made it over to Pate, but they're just very magical, or at least 20 years ago they were. I went for my honeymoon. It's very wonderful.
Has anybody else read her first book, Dust?
Oh yeah, we read it with this group.
It's worth reading. It's very wonderful also.
Is it a similar style, or is it a different, how does it compare?
I remember it as being much more sort of straightforward. It doesn't have the ocean at all. I'm remembering it as, I think the main characters are Samburu, which is a different, it's a different tribe from the ones from the Lamu archipelago. And someone is unjustly imprisoned, and I think it's the sister that comes to Nairobi to try to free him. That's what I'm remembering. I would have to pull it off the shelf and look it up. I could do that. And she also mentions at the end a film that's quite wonderful. If you haven't seen it, it's called Subira. It was Kenya's entry for the foreign documentary in, I think 2020 or 2018, something like that. It's a beautiful film. It's just great. It's about a young woman that wants to swim. And I'm a swimmer, so I like that. I like books. Yeah, it's a lovely film.
I'm curious for folks who are earlier in the book, if there's any other themes that you picked up on that you want to bring to the table, or questions that you may have earlier on in the book.
Be right back.
I think there are two themes that come to my mind. Or one is because it seems to me that this is a rich story of overlapping Muslim worlds in different countries. Like that's at least what I see of it, and of different kinds of people. So it's a very rich picture of, whether people are religious and where and what that means. And because there was actually, one of the words I had to look up was this mark somebody has on their forehead when they pray very heavily. And so it gave that visual of that kind of thing. I'm also getting just such a strong sense of the role of women in these different societies, and what the opportunities are and are not, and what the restrictions are, and how precarious that can be. That's what I'm picking up on anyway, of just even from, the mother figure to Ayaana herself. Yeah, that's just an interesting, who gets to go where, and what, how she's the best student, and then she can't even stay in school, and these various, they're sort of repeating stories this way that are different by gender assignment, I guess.
Yeah, that's a great point. And then it's wild to see through the rest of the trajectory of the book too, just despite all of these barriers, the kind of adventure, if you will, that she embarks on and what she is able to do, but also the restrictions and the situations she gets into because of those very factors that you're talking about. I definitely feel like something that I keep coming back to is just this idea of the sea, both how it weaves through all of kind of the quotes at the beginning of the chapters, but also this idea that we've been talking about of people kind of coming and going. For me, it really mirrors this idea of the tide and something, leaving and coming back. And as we see all these, the key core 5 figures, both cycling through all these different locations, but also always returning back to whatever this place of home is, or whether it is the island or their own respective homes. I just find that really interesting, and I think it's very well done in the way that she weaves that through the entire book.
So this is Dust, the first book. I don't know if you can see it very well. And it's not that he's imprisoned, he was actually killed. And so she goes and tries to figure out what's happening. It's very wonderful. No sea. There's no ocean in that one.
So I wanted to respond to Mia's question about what the people that were early in the book, what themes are they wondering about? One thing that I noticed is there were 2 like evil people in the beginning of the book. Fazul, who was the extremist trying to recruit people, and the man that came and tried to rape Ayaana. And they were very, they didn't have dimension for me. They were just evil. And I wonder if later in the book, those characters may exist and have more, have more depth rather than just being like this evil blotch on humanity. or just in general, is there like a complex character who's has an evil role?
From what I remember, those 2 characters don't really circle back later in the story, but I would say the character of Kore really is that person who we do get to spend a lot more time with, who is complex. I would definitely categorize him in the evil bucket with those figures, but it is complex because he comes back even after kind of some of the most horrific parts in my mind of the story. He still comes back, and he and Ayaana still have dialogue, they still interact. So there is you see kind of both the softness, but also kind of this undercurrent of unease, at least for me, unease whenever he's involved in the situation. So I think she wrote that character very well in kind of, the realistic sense of people who do evil things and may have that kind of within themselves, but also their ability to kind of flip-flop and be charming and kind of get away with some of these things, but also the things that torment them. So I think later in the book, you really see that character, and that's a really good example of more in-depth people, I would say.
I just wanted to say that I love that image of the tides. I think that works really well. And then, there's also a lot of tension between sort of I don't know, sort of visceral feelings and intuition versus intellect and schooling. Um, and so I think that it's really interesting that Ayaana is has this connection to the sea, and there's almost this sort of mystical connection that she has, and that she understands it, and then she becomes a nautical navigational specialist, so she gets also like the the schooling to know and understand the sea and the tides and how to navigate it. And so I think that's a really interesting dynamic throughout the book too.
And several times she points out that with all of this academic jargon and these tools, why didn't they just listen to the wise elders who could figure it out by the stars and the smells and the paths of the dragonflies? I love that. The Luddite in me was just like, yes, yes. You know, I'm so happy to come here and discuss it with you all because you are all very much more articulate than I am about finding parts of the book to describe more astutely. So thank you. Thank you for choosing it. Thank you for making this book club happen. I appreciate.
Yeah, thank you for being here.
I hope we will be able to continue on Zoom.
Yeah, we're definitely going to figure out ways that we can balance, because we know we have such an audience that's not physically here in the Bay Area. So it's definitely something we're figuring out how to make that possible.
Good.
I'm curious, we have a few minutes left of our meeting. If anyone else has some final thoughts you want to share out in the book before we share what we're going to read next.
I think the best thing I got today, I'm looking forward to finishing the book, but if I ever have time to read it again, the doing it with the Namwali Serpel book, The Old Drift, that would be just what a wonderful way to think about Eastern Africa. And maybe we need to build in a little bit more, or we have the other book too with the Ethiopia and the King book. That's just a nice way to think about
yeah, the shadow.
Right, the Shadow King, and then maybe that Vivian Johnson or whatever the name, V Johnson, just to get down to the curve of South Africa. It's just an interesting way to come from that angle. So I'm going to think of it. I'm going to think of it that way. Thank you.
And also the Ugandan novelist. I think her first name is Jennifer. Her first book or the famous book was Kintu, which is very long, and she's got a newer one, which is another big, long saga of East Africa, Uganda, inland a little bit.
It would be interesting to locate our books on a map.
Yeah, that'd be fun. Great.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
We've read a lot of books from different parts of Africa at this point.
That's it. Thank you, Elizabeth.
And I'm about to share a link in the chat as well for all the books. We have them available on Bookshop, where it lists out all the books that the book club has read, even prior to when we hosted it at Moad. So I'll share that as well, but I agree that it would be great to see these all on a map.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a good segue. We can talk about what we're going to be reading next month. I'm just trying to pull up the link quickly. Oh, Gabriel already has it. Great.
Great.
Perfect.
I got the link, Nia.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, we're reading How Beautiful.
What? Oh yeah, I'm in the middle of it.
Perfect. Already got a head start.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I'm actually both reading the book and listening to the audiobook, and the audiobook's really good.
Is it the author that's reading the audiobook or someone else?
It's a cast.
Okay, great.
Ooh.
Well, I'll be interested to hear when you come to the meeting, the comparison experiences of both physically reading and listening to an audiobook. I know for me, it's a very different experience doing one or the other.
I do both, and then I read and then I skip forward in the audiobook to get to where I stopped reading.
Great. Yeah, so thank you, Elizabeth, for putting the link in the chat. So our next meeting will be on July 25th at 5 p.m. As of now, the author is not joining us, but we'll be having a conversation amongst ourselves. The book is available at the Moad bookstore as well. So if you haven't gotten your copy, definitely recommend shopping there or at any of your other local bookstores. And we really appreciate all of you joining us for this conversation. I felt like I have also a new appreciation for the book, hearing all of your commentary. And I agree with you, but if I'm able to reread it, that's a pretty ambitious ask. But if I'm able to reread it, I think I'll definitely pick up on new things the next time around.
Yeah.
So before we close out, I just want to again thank everyone for being here and encourage you all to come to our next African Book Club on July 25th, but also to come to our other programming. We're doing a lot of programs in between now and then. You can view all of those on our website, which is Moad SF. If you are able to support us, we do appreciate that as well. If you are able to make a financial donation, you can do that through our website or via phone by texting 56512 and typing Moad SF. And the last ask that we have for you, if you are able to take a couple minutes following the program to fill out our program survey, which Elizabeth put in the chat as well. We do appreciate hearing from you what you enjoyed, any feedback you have for us, so we can figure out how to best support our communities. So thank you all for being here, and I'm excited for next month's discussion. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.